The TrutherGirls.
Hi everyone.
TrutherGirls.
So is ADHD a real medical condition or not? A lot of people have been saying all along that it doesn't exist, it's a made-up thing. People like teachers just can't cope with fidgety kids, and it's a conspiracy of the pharma industry to sell Ritalin. Well, now, Inventor of ADHD's deathbed confession, ADHD is a fictitious disease. So the psychiatrist, who is basically the inventor of ADHD, Leon Eisenberg, said a few months before dying that ADHD is a prime example of a fictitious disease, and that it's just, like people have been saying, a conspiracy to sell Ritalin. So does this mean that there is no problem and that all these kids who've been labeled have been labeled for no reason, they're fine, they're just fine, they're normal kids, everything's good? Is that the case? Or maybe not? Just in case you don't know much about ADHD, here in the New York Times is a description of ADHD and the subtypes and all the symptoms. And also, please have a look at this BBC documentary, Living with ADHD, where you can see what kids with ADHD are really like and why the parents and teachers and other people say, well, this can't be normal. This is way beyond the scope of what is, you know, a very active child. It's something quite different. Also, here's another interesting article about ADHD and some of the ramifications down the road. See, they say ADHD comes with comorbidities like depression, anxiety, and oppositional defiant disorder, which again sounds like a total bogus label. What's going on here is, though, that child who has these behavioral problems, which may have a biological or neuropsychiatric cause, a neurological cause, because their behavior it's so difficult for the adults to deal with, and they're constantly being corrected and directed and redirected and told, you're not listening, you're disobedient, why can't you do what I say, why can't you calm down? They get a lot of negative feedback, they have a lot of trouble at school, and you know, all this negative feedback and failure builds up and it erodes their self-esteem, and they start to think of themselves as bad, rotten kids and failures, and then they start to have anxiety or feel depressed or become oppositional and defiant. So are these psychiatric labels completely made up and useless? Well, I'd say yes and no. It's a bit like if you went to the hospital and you said you had stomach pain and they labeled you with stomach pain disorder. It really just labels the symptom, does nothing to tell you about what's going on underneath to cause the problem. And if then the treatment was to give you some painkillers, well, that's not much of a treatment or a solution. And I think it's the same thing with something like ADHD. There are problems there, but they're labeling it just according to the symptoms, and then they're just treating the symptoms with Ritalin, which is, in my opinion, a very bad solution. But why would I think that there really is something to it? Well, have a look at some of this research. For example, this, why French kids don't have ADHD. Well, as they mention here, 9% of American children are diagnosed with ADHD and treated with Ritalin versus only 5% in France. There are a few differences. One is that in France they don't use the DSM, they use something else, and they have a different approach to ADHD and other childhood psychiatric or neuropsychiatric disorders, which is more psychosocial, that they address it more with therapy and not with medication. And the other thing is that they have a more holistic approach, and they also look at the nutritional end of it. And I think this is very important, especially considering this, which recently came out as well. For 64% of kids with ADHD, food is the cause. There's a little picture of a boy here, and it says, did your child's unhealthy diet cause ADHD? But see, it's not that simple. It's not only the junk food. I mean, they're finding here that children, and they found the same thing in France, children with these kind of symptoms, if you will, they respond to stuff like, you know, getting the sugar out, getting rid of the food colors. A lot of kids are very sensitive to that. And also other foods, which may vary from child to child. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, it's the junk food. Maybe you're not feeding your kid junk food, and they're still acting like they're not quite in their right mind, and they're really, really hyperactive. And what they mention here are food sensitivities. And so a food that is perfectly okay for one person to eat may cause hyperactivity and a really altered mental state in another person. And one example of this would be gluten. Gluten, also casein for For some kids, it could be casein as well, and actually it could be really any food. And the way you could find out if you have these sensitivities is to do sensitivity testing, which is different than regular allergy testing. So here's the study. Restricted Elimination Diet for ADHD, the INCA study. And as the other article said, that the study found that 64% of children with ADHD, well, their symptoms improved or were resolved with dietary changes. So back to Leon Eisenberg saying ADHD is a made-up disorder. Well, if it's made up and there's no problem at all, then how come the symptoms improve with dietary changes? Well, probably because the disorder is made up, but the symptoms are real. The symptoms of ADHD and other neuropsychiatric childhood disorders are very real, and they're caused by underlying biological processes like toxicities, autoimmune problems, food sensitivities, all these kinds of things. Those symptoms are real, but the way that they're grouped together and labeled as a distinct psychiatric disorder, that is what's made up. That's what I think. And the solution being Ritalin, that's, you know, a conspiracy by the pharma industry. But it doesn't mean that there's no problem and that the kids are fine. I think our kids overall in North America aren't very healthy, and they have a lot of neuropsychiatric and other problems. But what we need to be looking at are the underlying causes, and stop grouping all those symptoms together and saying, well, look, he's got this batch of symptoms, let's call it ADHD. Because there's so much overlap with ADHD and autism, or autism and sensory processing disorder. There's so much overlap with all these things. You have to look at underlying causes of all these individual symptoms, or clusters of symptoms subgrouped, and address that, and then you're going to get healthier kids. So there is a problem. There is a problem, but it's not what they're telling you it is. Does that make sense? That's what I think it is. Well, leave me your comments, and thanks for listening to me, and I'll see you next time.